Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat, and with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion.
Welcome friends, readers, listeners, and viewers from across America and
Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess.
I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen here on
Seekers of lost
Radio,
paradise
and
may seem fools to
as
those
always,
who never
I
sought
thank all
the
of you
world.
for taking the time to listen to
Welcome to
our
Momentary
live
Zen
broadcast
with Zen
and
Garcia.
for supporting us.
Visit
www.fallenangels.tv. It's a great honor and
You're listening
pleasure
to Revolution
to be able
Radio.
to. All right, let's try this again. Welcome, friends, readers, listeners, and viewers from across America and around the world. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. As always, I appreciate all of you for taking the time to join the live broadcast and for supporting the network and all the various hosts that come to you in live stream on both Studio A and Studio B. Tonight I'm going to be speaking about the prior times. We have a lot of new listeners and a lot of individuals that have just recently been introduced to my work. And there's a lot of shows, I'm sure, that not all of you have had chance to listen to or to examine. And there's many issues which I know you have question on and are interested in. Some of the things that I do share in discussion are unique in Revelation and cover in depth how the ancient mysteries and the oral traditions and the mythology of the world come together in unison with the biblical narrative, and how these two merging together establish what is the story of not only modern humanity, but as well as the pre-Adamic beings, the hominids, which existed during the First World Age and before the destruction of the world as we've come to know it. And of course, there is evidence which confirm not only the story of the biblical flood and the deluge during Noah's day and how the Most High God destroyed the world during those times, specifically because of the involvement and the interdiction of the fallen angels with the daughters of Cain, and how it is that it was their involvement with the hybrid children of Cain, the daughter specifically, which brought about the presence of what we've come to know in the mythology as the men of renown, the demigod heroes that are born of both sky and earth, the angels, or the so-called pagan pantheon of gods and goddesses, which we see time and time again that they had involvement with and not only interacted but engaged in sexual copulation and those kind of sexual trysts with human beings. And this goes for both female and male, in that we have also seen historically evidence of what are called succubi and incubi, and these particular deities, these demons, how they also engaged with and interacted with humanity on both spiritual and physical level. And these stories have been written off largely as simply legend. Even in other faiths, we see the mention of supernatural beings such as the Naga, which in the Hindu mythology were reptilian beings, children of the serpent that also had a seraphic appearance. And then in other cultures, you have stories of the Jinn and how they, like the genie in the bottle, how these demonic beings, some were contained in and would grant favor or supernatural request to those that would free them from their imprisonment within certain objects which were able to, however, in what manner, I don't know, but to contain them and to imprison them and to hold them for time and generation. In that we see even recently there's the individuals that are interested in these Dybbuk boxes and how these particular boxes were connected to other demonic forces. And so we're going to examine some of these stories and connect some of it to other mythologies, which are, still relatively unknown to certain people and certain cultures, but are important for consideration when you really consider humanity's war against these spiritual forces. And so I'm going to read and share certain stories about the Atlantean age to kind of bring forth in examination the topic of these particular wars and these interactions with these deities and humanity, and to read certain stories which not a lot of people are familiar with, just to give you something to consider. And again, for a lot of people that are not familiar with my work, this might be something to give you insight into things you might not have otherwise really given consideration to. And so we'll go into that here in just a short few minutes. But I did also want to make mention that we will be hosting here in March a conference here in Atlanta, which will have numerous speakers talking about a lot of end time mysteries and a lot of topics which would be beneficial for helping you to understand what's going on in the world and to really be able to prepare yourself and your family for, things that not a lot of people really have given consideration to with regard to the end of days. And so, let me pull up this article and then we'll examine it. For those that have not heard, I'm going to be looking at and reading possibly from both the Emerald Tablets and another text called the Colbrin Bible, which, a lot of people haven't read either of or heard either of. And both are very interesting texts in that they cover the end time narrative or speak about the interactions of some of the Atlanteans, what are represented as the Atlanteans, with humanity. And so let's look at this. It says this in the Emerald Tablets. I thought the Atlantean, master of mysteries, keeper of records, mighty king, magician living from generation to generation, being about to pass into the halls of Amente, set down for the guidance of those that are to come after these records of the mighty wisdom of great Atlantis. In the great city of Kior, on the island of Undal, in a time far past, I began this incarnation, not as the little men of the present age did. The mighty ones of Atlantis live and die, but rather from eon to eon did they renew their life in the halls of Amente, where their river of life flows eternally onward. 100 times 10 have I descended the dark way that led into light, and as many times have I ascended from the darkness into the light, my strength and power renewed. Now for a time I descend, and the men of Chem shall know me no more, but in a time yet unborn will I rise again, mighty and potent, requiring an accounting of those left behind me. Then beware, O men of Chem, if ye have falsely betrayed my teaching, for I shall cast ye down from your high estate into the darkness of the caves from whence ye came. Betray not my secrets to the men of the north or the men of the south, lest my curse fall upon ye. Remember and heed my words, for surely will I return again and require of thee that which ye guard. Even from beyond time and from beyond death will I return, rewarding or punishing, as ye have requited your trust. Great were my people in the ancient days, great beyond the conception of the little people now around me. When it says little people, it means that they were smaller in stature. Knowing the wisdom of old, seeking far within the heart of infinity, knowledge that belonged to earth's youth. Wise were we with the wisdom of the children of light, who dwelt among us, Strong were we with the power drawn from the eternal fire. And of all these, greatest among the children of men was my father, Thotme, keeper of the great temple, link between the children of light, who dwell within the temple, and the races of men who inhabited the 10 islands. Mouthpiece after the 3 of the dweller of Unal, speaking to the kings with a voice that must be obeyed, grew I there from a child into manhood, being taught by my father the elder mysteries, until in time there grew within the fire of wisdom, until it burst into a consuming flame. Not desired I but the attainment of wisdom, until on a great day the command came from the dweller of the temple that I be brought before him. Few there were among the children of men who had looked upon that mighty face and lived, for not as the sons of men are the children of light, when they are not incarnate in a physical body. Chosen was I from the sons of men, taught by the dweller, so that his purposes might be fulfilled, purposes yet unborn in the womb of time. Long ages I dwelt in the temple, learning ever and yet ever more wisdom, until I too approached the light emitted from the great fire. Taught me he the path to Amente, the underworld, where the great king sits upon his throne of might. Deep I bowed in homage before the lords of life and the lords of death, receiving as my gift the key of life. Free was I of the halls of Amente, bound not by death to the circle of life. Far to the stars I journeyed, until space and time became as naught. And then, having drunk deep of the cup of wisdom, I looked into the hearts of men, and there found I greater mysteries, and was glad. For only in the search for truth could my soul be stilled, and the flame be quenched. Down through the ages I lived, seeing those around me taste of the cup of death, and return again in the light of life. Gradually from the kingdoms of Atlantis, past waves of consciousness that had been one with me, only to be replaced by spawns of a lower star. In obedience to the law, the word of the Master grew into flower, downward into the darkness turned the thoughts of the Atlanteans, until at last in this wrath arose from his aguante, the dweller speaking the word and calling the power. Deep in earth's heart, the sons of Amente heard and hearing, directing the changing of the flower of fire that burns eternally, changing and shifting using the logos, until that great fire changed its direction. Over the world then broke the great waters, drowning and sinking, changing earth's balance, until only the temple of light was left, standing on the great mountain on Undal, still rising out of the waters. Some there were who living, saved from the rush of the fountains. Called to me then the Master, saying, Gather ye together, my people, take them by the arts ye have learned, afar across the waters, until ye reach the land of the hairy barbarians, dwelling in caves of the desert. Follow there the plan that ye know of. Gathered I then my people, and entered the great ship of the Master. Upward we rose into the morning. Dark beneath us lay the temple. Suddenly, over it rose the waters, vanished from earth, until the time appointed was the great temple. Fast we fled toward the sun on the morning, until beneath us lay the land of the children of Chem. Raging they came with cudgels and spears, lifted in anger seeking to slay and utterly destroy the sons of Atlantis. And then I raised my staff and directed a ray of vibration, striking them still in their tracks as fragments of stone of the mountain. Then spoke I to them in words calm and peaceful, telling them of the might of Atlantis, saying, we were children of the sun and its messengers. Cowed I them by my display of magic science, until at my feet they groveled. And when I released them, long dwelt we in the land of Chem, long and yet long again, until obeying the commands of the Master, who while sleeping yet lives eternally, I sent from me the sons of Atlantis, and sent them in many directions, that from the womb of time wisdom might rise again in her children. A long time dwelt I in the land of Chem, doing great works by the wisdom within me. Upward grew into the light of knowledge the children of Chem, watered by the rains of my wisdom. Blasted I then a path to Amente, so that I might retain my powers, living from age to age, a son of Atlantis, keeping the wisdom, preserving the records. Great grew the sons of Chem, conquering the people around them and growing slowly upwards in soul force. Before the lords of power face to face, one again with the dweller, raised I high over the entrance a doorway, a gateway leading down to Amente. Few there would be with courage to dare it, few past the portal to dark Amente. Raised over the passage I a mighty pyramid, and using the power that overcomes earth force, deep and yet deeper place I a force house or chamber, and from it carved I a circular passage, reaching almost to the great summit. There in the apex set I the crystal, sending the ray into the time-space, drawing the force from out of the ether, concentrating upon the gateway of Amente. Other chambers I built and left vacant to all seeming yet hidden. Within them are the keys of Amente. He who in courage would dare the dark realms, let him be purified first by long fasting. Builded I the great pyramid, patterned after the pyramid of earth force, burning eternally so that it too might remain through the ages. In it I builded my knowledge of magic science, so that I might be here when again I return from Amente. All right, I'm going to stop there and explain this particular story. This is from the first tablet. And the land of Chem gets its name from Ham. And it is connected to Egypt. And this particular text speaks about the destruction of Atlantis and how it was drowned. And that when it was drowned, it was covered over by the waters of the deep. And that it was then that the Atlanteans, as James Churchward speaks about in his book, the symbols, the people, and the mythology of Mu, which Mu was the name of the original motherland that the Atlanteans dwelt on and lived upon before the later destruction. And it shows that in James Churchward's books, it talks about this ancient culture that existed long before the cultures of humanity, even the pre-Adamites that were spread across the world, created by God in Genesis 1:26 through 28, that they were created in couples, in many different races, male and female created he them, and spread them out to the world, and told them to multiply and to replenish it. And that's what happened, is that the pre-Adamites, they lived in different places all over the world. And then you find the story of the coming of the sons of Atlantis after the destruction of Atlantis during what is the Diaspora, and how it was that they were spread far and wide during that time, that they then took the knowledge of high culture, capability, magic, and knowledge, and also they instituted the worship of the feathered serpent, as well as human and blood sacrifice, the knowledge of the calendar, and how people should be controlled by the priesthoods, the cone-headed ones, the giants of old, that they utilize the priesthood and these populations as the control mechanism. The ones who made decision and that taught and ruled over the different, what are called, primitive peoples or primitive tribes worldwide. And that's why we see in the stories of the oral traditions of peoples all over the world evidence of this same theme being repeated over and over and over. And this is also in manner connected to the creation of modern humanity by the Most High God, by the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and how it would be through modern humanity that judgment would be imposed and redemption for the children of humanity, the sons of Adam, but for the children of the serpent and for Legion and the fallen angels, that ruled over and through, with the divine right to rule, the seed of Cain, that judgment would come for and Christ incarnating into flesh, becoming God here on earth and in this world, that he would restore humanity and knowledge of the true Godhead, and knowledge of where we had fallen from, knowledge of who we truly are, and how his and even our kingdom is not of this world, that we are from a different place altogether, but are guests here in this world. And so most people not understanding that, they are forced to study everything in order to make sense of what is. Because truly there's so much disinformation, so much lost, forgotten, and forbidden knowledge, that it is hard to come to discernment on all of these things and to piece together the puzzle of truth so that we can make sense of our past and even our present and how that leads to future. It's not it's not an easy thing to do, to dig up the truth, to then be able to understand one's place within the world, and also to understand the prophetic side of what has occurred and what has been kept as knowledge, historical knowledge about what happened in our past. And even though, again, it is difficult to really understand what true history is and what isn't, because so much has been wiped out and then so much made up that, it's hard to make sense of anything. Even the timeline, as we have been recently studying, even the history of Tartarian mud flood and how all of that has been hidden away as well. And so, again, for those that are new to not only my work, but, there are so many others that speak about the prior times and the, how to understand the Sumerian kings list and the histories as written down and passed on by historians such as Manthea and Berosus and others. There's a text attributed to Manthea which speaks about, and he was the one that wrote down the history of the prior times for the Egyptians. And then Berosus, who was a Chaldean priest historian, he took on that same task. And these two gentlemen were responsible in large for giving us and preserving an account of the ancient times. And their work has been largely decimated. We see, especially Berosus, that his work only exists in quotation through the words and work of others. That his knowledge and insight has been so eradicated from public consideration that, again, we have no idea, no knowledge of what occurred in our ancient past. And these things affect us with regard to, well, how do we make sense of, our place within the world? And how do we make sense of the prophecies of, like, for instance, the 4 kingdoms as cited by Daniel and the coming of the Son of Man? And, for a lot of people that do embrace, read, and study the knowledge of the pagan cultures, pagan empires, for them, they, a lot of them consider, well, why should we believe anything that is not as old? And wouldn't everything stem from the oldest culture? And wouldn't that be closer to the truth than what we know as far as, like, for instance, what people say of the modern faith of Christianity? But what they don't understand is that there is a culture and a people and a tradition which is older than these Sumerian peoples and the cuneiform text and the knowledge of, they attribute the gods as coming down from the other planets, and that these gods were the ones that created us. And yet, when you examine the stories that have just recently come out, the Thracian chronicles and the history of the Thracian people and how their language just was recently translated, and the stories that are given account, for instance, in the book of Nave, it talks about how Orpheus, who's known in Greek mythology as the individual that went down into Hades in order to try to bring back his wife, but then turning back, she was lost. Anyways, I don't see that story repeated in the Thracian chronicles. I'm not saying it's not true, but the story that I know of regarding Orpheus in the Thracian history is that he was a priest king that was appointed by the elder priests to fulfill a certain prophecy, and that upon doing so, that he was led by the Holy Spirit. He was led by the Holy Spirit to the rediscovery of so many ancient pots that were buried in, cataclysm. And it could have been from this time, when Atlantis went down. In some of these ancient cultures. But of course, they were believers. The Thracians were Christians, and they were believers in Christ, and they knew that he was the Son of God, that he would be the Passover lamb, that being crucified and resurrected would bring salvation to the world. And it is he who is described in their mystery as Dionysus, the god Isis. Isis meaning Jesus or Yahushua. And they tell the story of how he, as the light of the world, was responsible with the Father and the Mother, the Holy Spirit with the manifestation of all things. And yet most of the world has no knowledge, no insight, and has never heard of the Thracian people or the Thracian script or this knowledge base that I'm speaking about. And because of that, they believe that the Bible has been plagiarized, stolen from the Sumerian traditions, and that the story of the flood of Noah follows in part the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that is dependent upon and was counterfeited. Even the so-called virgin birth of Tammuz and other individuals, that they are associated as being Christ-like. But what we don't understand about these beings is that their mythologies are dependent upon the Thracian stories of the Son of God, the Logos. And I write about this in great detail in my book called The Primary Adamic Literature, where I share the narrative of the stories of Adam and Eve going back in time and as scattered all across the world and found in different cultures, that this information affirms what I'm talking about here. And so this is, in my opinion, the missing piece for how to understand the way that the biblical narrative and the prophecies of the coming of Christ, as told to Adam and Eve when cast out of paradise, how they fit into the story of humanity. And again, how it is that these myths, these legends of the coming of Yeshua, the first and second coming, because it speaks about both in prophetic language. It shares his first and second comings, and how really the salvation and eternal life of humans is dependent upon the incarnation of God into this world, and that the Father would give of his Son in order to redeem us and to rectify the fall. And it's only because people don't understand this part of the puzzle that they think Christians are foolish, and they think that anybody that believes in Christ as Savior and Messiah, that we've been brainwashed, that we've been somehow blinded. And there's a movement, a procession of individuals now that also believe that Yahweh, the Father, as spoken about and cited in the Old Testament, that somehow he is Satan rather than God. That and they believe the so-called Gnostic experts who say that the demiurge is the God of the Old Testament, when the Gnostic manuscripts themselves do not say that. There's one place where they speak of Yahweh as being a son of the demiurge, but they don't say that he's the demiurge himself. And also, there's no confirming witness for such belief. And that when you really examine the Gnostic manuscripts, they actually cover and speak about the demiurge as being named Saklas, Samael, the angel of death, the viper of God, which Samael is also the name of the serpent in Genesis 3:6 in the Targum, when it speaks of that serpent that beguiled Eve in subtlety. It speaks of him as being wickedly evil, and that he was knowledgeable in the devices of evil, and that he used his understanding to lead her astray, to tempt her and to cause her to fall. And so the feathered serpent, which was worshipped during the ancient times, this particular being is cited as being evil. And he is also referenced in the scriptures as being the father of lies. And that same title, that same knowledge is also spoken of Cain, who was said to be a liar, a deceiver, and a murderer. Which is interesting that the Gospel of Philip also brings forth and connects Cain with being a child of the serpent. Which, these things that I speak about is also contained within the scriptures, even though most people deny it. And it says specifically, and Christ said himself and revealed it in parable, that Cain, he's the progenitor of the tares, and the tares are the children of the enemy. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 12, it says that Cain, who was of that wicked one, the son of, child of, descendant of the wicked one. And it says that the enemy which sowed them is the devil. So it's very clear, and it's only because this knowledge has been swept away and this insight hidden from so many that most deny and do not understand this particular truth and how it weighs on and impacts the reality of who we are in conflict in and with, even in this day and age. The symbology of, the eye at the top of the Illuminati pyramid, the New World Order, the worship of the feathered serpent, the tree and sexual icons, iconography, how all that is connected to the garden, the temptation of Eve, her beguilement by the serpent, her impregnation with Cain, and then the Genesis 3:15, the prophecy of the enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And so things to consider. And I think that when you do consider them, they will lead you to truth in a way that most people have never revealed to you, as well as never considering such. One really is not able to make sense of world. All right, we'll be right back.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
All right. Welcome back, everybody, for a second hour. I am your host, Zen Garcia, and this is Momentary Zen here on Revolution Radio. We are speaking about the prior times and the Atlantean age and how and what it was connected to and how it fits into the timeline and the narrative of the story of humanity. And in first portion, I read about the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the story of Thoth, the Atlantean priest king, who was one of the sons of Atlantis, one of the sons of the morning that after the destruction of Atlantis was sent to different parts of the world. And specifically, he went to the land of Chem, which was the land of Egypt. And he describes having built the Great Pyramid over what was an entryway down into Amenti, which Amenti is the place of the dead. And so he speaks about having constructed this passageway to what would be the heart of the realms of the dead, and how he and his people, they are connected to this particular place called Amenti, which is where Satan rules. We know that in the scriptures he rules in the interior of the earth, and that his realm is within a place called Sheol or hell. And so Legion and the demonic forces connected to Legion, and in this case, these particular Atlanteans, they are also connected to Amenti. And we see that they are serpent-headed. They are reptilian in nature. And you can find further revelation of that in the Emerald Tablets number 8, where it speaks of these beings, these seraphic, dragon-like entities, that they took over and became in possession of the kings and queens of the earth, the bloodlines which ruled, and that held power to control all the peoples of the world. And in doing so, that they basically were able to not only subject humanity to their will, in much like the whole, that show V about the visitors and how they are masquerading around as humans, but that under the facade they are reptilian in nature. I mean, you ask yourself, who came up with such story? And why would they use those kind of themes? And then learning what we learn about Scripture and about, the hybrid nature of the seed of Cain and how Cain was said to have a seraphic appearance and that he was born a child of the wicked one, that he was the progeny of the serpent. I mean, these kind of things are encoded into the legends of humanity. And when you come to understand the story of who we are, and as well as that there is another amongst us, those who try to intermingle with the seed of men, that this particular ancient serpent bloodline, that they are the ones that perpetuate, propagate, and persist. Okay, I think you lost me there for a few seconds. But we seem to be reconnected, and so I'm going to continue. And I want to share with you one other story for your consideration. And this is a fascinating tale, and I had made a mention of it. It is from the Colbrin Bible. And it also speaks about the motherland as the land of not Mu, as James Churchward alludes to it, but Kahemu, which I wish I knew what the different syllables actually meant and the breakdown in the language. If somebody knows and can understand, what the Ka, Ka, and He and Mu actually mean and can relate it to me, I would be greatly appreciative. But anyway, so it calls it the land of Kahemu. And so this is a story not many people are familiar with and are knowledgeable about. It, as I said, comes from the Colbrin Bible. Hold on a second. Somebody is messaging me. I don't know how to check it though, so I can keep going. All right. I think this will blow you away. And those that have not heard about it, it's a really interesting, it gives you great insight into the stories of Atlantis. And this is, because it is not very well known or heard about, thus I want to bring it forth for your consideration. And I know that a lot of people are familiar with, the stories of Atlantis and Plato's story of Critias and Timaeus, and perhaps even the narrative of James Churchward, who says in his account in the translations of these ancient clay tablets, he says that he was taught how to read the language of the Atlanteans by a very ancient guardian of these ancient records, that he was able to convince him to bring them forth just to check on the quality and if they were still intact and in preservation. And they then, after having done so, they translated them, and they told the story about a people that had escaping the land, this mother culture, that it had been destroyed in judgment. And it's similar to, again, the stories of Atlantis. But this ancient account, too, brings forth the story of that ancient judgment, which the Bible also talks about in similarity, the story of this judgment. And it was because of the fallen angels, opened up these dark portals and inviting into this world these dark entities, and the Emerald Tablets speak about that as well. So if you want to know more about the story of Atlantis, I would read the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the James Church words, the symbols and the people and the culture of Mu, and I would read the scroll of Thotis in its entirety, which I'm not going to bring forth in fullness here, but I will cover in aspect. It says this: the first land on earth wherein men dwelt was not Kahamu. It was a land out beyond the salt waters. To this land came the immortal spirit in the form of a radiant one from heaven, who had left his more enlightened place to dwell among beasts in the lower kingdom of sorrow. In some mysterious way he became incarnated as man. How, we know not, but he founded the race of man. It is not as recorded in tales told for the ignorant. I want to add that, in my opinion, this is connected to the story of Satan and how Christ said I saw Satan like lightning fall from the heavens. And this, where he founded the race of man in this particular story, is not that he created man, but he did experiment and enslave and try to attempt to make as slave race the pre-Adamites that were here before the creation of modern humanity, which I'll talk about that as well, but let us continue. It is not as recorded in tales told for the ignorant. None knows in truth the old motherland where it was. There are tales, but they disagree. The 9 bows say it was southward. The learned are not united in thought. Some say towards the west, where the sun now sets, while others say towards the east, where the sun rises. Southward are great mountains and forests, monsters, and men covered with hair. Here winds are formed within the earth, issue forth from a black cavern. It is a place of chaos where water, soil, and air are not separate. The old motherland could not have been there. To the left-hand side there is a great wilderness, the land of Amua. The old motherland could not have given birth to such as these. To the right hand is the wide plain of man-eaters, which stretches out to the far reaches of old Kamu. This was barren even in the oldest times. To the north of the wilderness, the land is occupied by deformed men and dwarves, where amid this could have been the fertile pastures and plowlands, well watered from the Sky River, where men lived in peaceful content. The old motherland was never there, nor, as some say, in the waters beyond, which boil at the extremity. Beyond the wide river there once was a land graced with all riches, needful to men, crowned by many walled Meru. We know that Meru is the mountain in the center of the earth. But it was not the land of our birth, northward the home of the cool breeze, but beyond the lands which skirt the salt water are the one-eyed peoples, and the giants with white hair and eyes. Here the rocks and stones are of the whitest marble, and the trees bear white fruit. Thus, in the whiteness, the eyes of men are blinded. Here the rocks and stones are of the whitest marble, and the trees bear white fruit. Thus in the whiteness the eyes of men are blinded in their youth, for even the grass grows white. Before this is the land of Hasugia, a place unproductive and barren, where fruit never appears on the trees and crops will not ripen. How could the old motherland lie in this direction? In the old book, it is said that the old motherland was ruled by the Queen of Light, who was supreme above all. The temple tales tell that the lesser gods came to dwell among mortals when the mistress of brightness ruled in Galatia, that they were sheltered in temples, and priests were appointed to minister unto them. It is said that places of instruction were set up within the temples, but few men were taught the inner knowledge. It was rightfully held that it would be a danger to those without wisdom, and it had to be safeguarded. Is this not the tale told in the Book of Beginnings? It is said that Kalati lay within the borders of Kamu, but could it not have been the land of similar sounding name, outward from Pontus, beyond God's land? Is it not set up both that they were engulfed in fire and water? In the Book of Beginnings, it is said the generations passed, and a vast amount of knowledge and wisdom was accumulated and preserved in purity. It was the heritage of mankind, but though man had learned to cherish the light of truth and walk wisely with it, nevertheless, then as now, false priesthoods flourished. They pandered to the carnal desires of the underdeveloped and exploited the weaknesses of the ignorant. Their iniquity built up a vast weight of evil in the netherworld, which projected itself into the material of earth, so that the powers which upheld it became unstable. This caused all the southern part of the old land to sink down into heaving waters. This disaster was brought about through the ascendance of evil. Rites which awakened the dead were rife among the carnal-minded and ignorant, while those who remained steadfast on the harder road of spiritual development had fixed their eyes on the light ahead, ignoring the pitfalls at their feet. It was then, even as now. Will man ever learn? This was the aspect of the disaster as written in the Book of Beginnings. There were openings in the land from which evil vapors poured forth. As a mist descending upon the people like a mantle, it spread out and covered the whole face of the land. The tongues of the people were stopped, and they became dumb with fear. The ground trembled beneath them, and great tongues of flame shot up. The whole land heaved and rocked like an ocean wave as it rose and fell, groaned and shook. The fires which strove beneath burst forth to be met with shafts of lightning, striking down from heaven. A thick black cloud of smoke filled the land, and men were smothered in dust. As the setting sun rested on the horizon, it could be but dimly seen beneath the cloud as a fiery red ball. And when it had gone, a gray, dense darkness prevailed, lit only by great sheets of lightning. The waters broke heavily over the land, sweeping it clean. The plains and cities were covered, and new shores formed around the mountains. The waters mounted up until all that moved and lived was covered. The land was submerged. Mountain tops alone remained above the rush of uplifted torrent. Whirlwinds blew and brought cold winds which cleared away the dust and debris. Mud banks were formed, and a mountain mouth remained open to spew forth vile vapors. During one long, awful night, the doomed land was torn apart, and southward sank out of sight forever. A wise man has written this was not mountain girt Kalathi or age-old Ramaku. This was the land out in the green waters where the sun sets beyond Keftu, near the lands of Henbua. It is then said they came through the marshes and across the wild mountains beyond the barren places of stone into a new land called Ankara. Here grew the great life tree known even the days of our fathers. This is the tree of strange aspect, like unto no other. Though in the days of our fathers it was barren and enclosed in flames. Now we know that the life tree grew in Talus, which is towards the lands of Dawn, by Pontus. Therefore could not the old motherland have been found hereabouts? Not all was inundated. It is said that men came out of the devastation. Behind them the land sank, and the earth shook. Mountains split apart and crumbled. Where once there had been a valley, now stood a mountain. The air was filled with smoke, and hot rocks were hurled down from out of the sky. Men choked in brimstone. Great winds howled like 1,000 unearthly wild dogs. They'd left all behind them and came across the wild places to the land of refuge. Was not Kamu once known to some men as the land of refuge? Therefore the whereabouts of the old motherland is not unknown. It is said that when men came from the old land, the everlasting stars rested where earth meets heaven, but none knows how many lifetimes have passed since then. Thus, it is not impossible to discover where the old motherland lay. Therefore, there is hope, and men need not despair, for the secret may be rediscovered when once again the sacred things rest in the old land from whence they came. The days of disturbance will cease, and once again men will live in peace. Men go forth to seek the road. All is not lost to us yet. All right. That was the scroll of Thothis. And so I want to highlight a few things here. Interestingly, it speaks about at the very beginning, just like in the Emerald Tablets, which let me actually pull that up. In the Emerald Tablets, it talks about how they called up these dark beings from below. And because of that, that's what led to the destruction of the earth. I'll read to you here. Speak I of ancient Atlantis. Speak of the days of the kingdom of shadows. Speak of the coming of the children of shadows. Out of the great deep were they called by the wisdom of earth men, called for the purpose of gaining great power. Far in the past, before Atlantis existed, men there were who delved into darkness using dark magic, calling up beings from the great deep below us. Forth came they into this cycle. Formless were they of another vibration, existing unseen by the children of earth men. Only through blood could they have form being. Only through man could they live in the world. And so, it goes into greater detail about how they offered up the blood sacrifice to these particular beings, and they were able to come and dwell among men. And then it says that in the form of man they amongst us, but only to sight were they as our men. Serpent-headed when the glamour was lifted, but appearing to man as men among men, crept they into the councils and taking forms that were like unto men, slaying by their arts the chiefs of the kingdom. Taking over their form, they rule over man. Sought they from the kingdom of shadows to destroy man and to rule in his place. And so you see that this same story is connected to even what is revealed in, again, this, the story of the Colbrin Bible, that it was because they were calling up these beings from below and doing these dark and evil sacrifices that judgment was brought upon them. And it also speaks about, about Satan, the radiant one from heaven, who came and dwelt among men, and then in some mysterious way he became incarnated as man. And we see that in the story of Isaiah and also Ezekiel chapter 28, that Satan will die the death of a man, that the word of the Lord, Yeshua, will call forth a fire that will burn him from the inside out, and that he will die in front of his children, the kings and queens that rule over this world, and they will wonder at the beast. I mean, all these things are scriptural. And so anyways, this is how this story ties into, and this goes back to the prior times, because again, in looking at and examining my work, we learned that Satan and the rebel angels, that they were cast out of the heavens on the second day. They were placed here upon the earth even before the fall of humanity, that they ruled in this world. They created these megalithic structures and these ancient cities, the ancient mother culture, Atlantis, Lemuria, and all these legendary cities. They were inhabited by the fallen ones. Dwarka, the stories of the wars amongst the angelic, the rebel angels that were here, that lived here upon the earth, and that made war against each other in that ancient time. All this makes sense when you understand that the angels were here before we were. And that's also why it is that the legacy of these ancient traditions is, as Hesiod describes in his Works and Days, that when the angels ruled here upon the earth, that was called the Golden Age. And then you had a Silver Age and a Bronze Age and an Iron Age. And each time the lifespan of the demigods was reduced. And then from afterward, that the appearance of humanity in the form of Adam and Eve, that they came much later, but that the angels were here first. And so, once you understand that, you'll be able to make sense of what we see in the archaeological, the geological, and the as far as, examining the mythology of the world, the anthropological record, that they were here previous to us. And that's why we have all the stories of the different cultures which speak about how they were here. The different indigenous people that speak about the islands. And these people, and why it is that we find in the bottoms of the oceans megalithic structures and cities that once existed that were not, that humanity was not capable of constructing. There's no way. And so, let me see. I'm going to look for one more story. This is the accounting of what is known as, he is known as, what's his name? Credo Mutwa. Yes. Let us see. Yeah, I'll read this to you here in just a second. Just gotta find it. Okay. It says this. But when the Chitauri arrived in Africa, they told our people that they were gods and that they were going to give us human beings great gifts on one condition. We had to worship them and accept them as our creators. Some told our people that they were our elder brothers and that this earth had produced them generations ago. And they said they had come back to the green womb of their mother and that they were going to make us into gods. Jabilon, sir, is a very strange god. He is supposed to be the leader of the Chitauli. He is a god, to my great surprise, which I find certain groups of white people especially worshiping. 1 second. All right. He is a god, to my great surprise, which I find certain groups of white people especially worshiping. We have known about Jabulan for many, many centuries, we black people. But I am surprised that there are white people who worship this god, and these people, amongst them are people who many have blamed for all the things that have happened on this earth, namely the Freemason people. We believe that Jabulan is the leader of the Chitauli. He is the old one, and of his names, and one of his names in the African language, sir, is Umbaba Samhongo, the Lord King, the great father of the terrible eyes. Because we believe that Jabulan has got one eye, which if he opens it, you die. If he looks at you, before human beings were created on this planet, there had existed a very wise race of people known as the Immanucala. These people had come from the constellation known to white people as Orion, and they had inhabited our earth for thousands and thousands of years. And that before they had left our earth to return once more to the sacred spider constellation, they made a great evacuation under the earth beneath the Ruwensari mountains, the mountains of the moon, and deep in the bowels of Mother Earth, the Immanucala built a city of copper buildings, a city with a wall of silver all around it, a city built at the huge mountain of pure crystal, the mountain of knowledge, the mountain from which all knowledge on earth comes, and a mountain to which all knowledge on earth ultimately returns. No matter where you go in Africa, no matter how deep into the interior of the dark continent you tread, you will find a very ancient stories which are incredibly similar. You will find African tribes and races who tell you that they are descendants from gods who came out of the skies thousands of years ago. However, say that these gods came to them from the sea in magical boats made out of reeds or wood or copper or even gold. In some cases, these gods and goddesses are described as beautiful human beings whose skins were either bright blue or green or even silver. But most of the time you will find it being said that these great gods, one second, okay, that time you will find it being said that these great gods, especially the ones that came out of the sky, were non-human, scaly creatures, which lived most of the time in mud or in water. Creatures of an extremely frightening and hideously ugly appearance. Some say that these creatures were like crocodiles with crocodile-like teeth and jaws, but with very large round heads. Some say that these creatures are very tall beings with snake-like heads set on long, thin necks, very long arms, and very long legs. There are those that tell us that these gods who came from the skies traveled through the land in magical boats made of bright metal, silver, copper, or gold, boats which had the ability to sail over water or even to fly through the sky like birds. Throughout Africa, we are told that these mysterious beings taught human beings many things. They taught human beings how to have laws, knowledge of herbal medicine, knowledge of arts, and knowledge of the mysteries of creation and the cosmos as a whole. We are told that some of these gods had the ability to change their shapes at will. They had the ability to assume the shape and the appearance of any creature that there is on earth whenever they had good reason to do so. A sky god could even turn itself into a rhinoceros, an elephant, or even a stork. A sky god could even turn itself into a rock or even a tree. In Africa, these mysterious gods are known by various names. In West Africa, in the land of the Bumbara people, these amphibian or reptilian sky gods are known as the Zishweze. The word Zishweze means either the swimmers or the divers. Swimmers or the divers or the gliders. It was said that these sky gods could dive from above the clouds down to the top of a mountain. Whenever they felt like it, they could also take deep dives into the bottom of the ocean and from there fetch magical objects and then bring them to the shore, placing them at the feet of the astonished black people. In the land of the Dogon people, we find the famous Nomo, or race of reptilian or amphibious beings who were said to have come from the Sirius star to give knowledge and religion to the black people of Dogon. One is told that when the Nomo arrived from the sky in their fantastic sky ships, there were several of them, 13 or 14 of them, and they created a lake around the sky ship. And every morning they used to swim from their sky ship to the shores of the lake and there preach to the people who assembled in large numbers around the lake. It is said that before the Nomo departed, returning with a great noise back to their home star, they first chose one of their number, killed it, and cut its body up into little pieces, and then gave these pieces to the assembled people to eat in the first sacrificial ritual of its kind on earth. When the people had eaten the sacred flesh of the star creature and drunk its blood mixed with water, the Nomo took the lower jar of the creature and by in some incredible fact of magic brought the whole creature back to life again. We are told that this is the way that the Nomo taught our people, that there is no death and that behind every death there shall be a resurrection. In the Americas, the South and Central America mostly, the feathered serpent is called Quetzalcoatl, and amongst my people, the Zulus, we find belief in a serpent called Yodandala. The Yodandala is said to be a huge mamba, or a huge python whose neck is covered in great grayish-bluish feathers, like the feathers of a blue crane, and at the top of the serpent's head grow 3 feathers, one green, one red, one a white one, which looks like huge ostrich tail feathers. And so we can see, by even this particular, the story of this ancient people that, they also spoke about the feathered serpent, and that Credo Mutwa, who was a South African Sangoma, a medicine man, who's been given knowledge of the ancient legends passed down from thousands of generations of his people, and how these serpentine sky gods, sky beings, came down to them and, basically gave them knowledge, but they had to do sacrifice, and they had to accept them as their gods. And we see that there's a connection to the Freemasons and how they worshipped what is called Jabulon. which that's the name of their god in Freemasonry, which I thought was interesting because it also is the feathered serpent. Satan, the ancient dragon, that old serpent which deceiveth the whole world. These strange legends, the modern day Freemasonic belief system, and the ancient oral traditions and the biblical narrative, they all come together to tell you the story of the rebel angels and their fall from grace. They're being cast down, exiled here to the earth, placed under the authority of death, and how it was that they, in ancient times, that they ruled over the peoples, and that they demanded reverence. And so that's the story of the feathered serpent. And that's the story of the rebel angels and their involvement with humanity in, these very ancient times. And so I hope that you were able to gain some insight into this knowledge, this long lost ancient traditions, and I hope that it blesses your life and helps you to understand what we are contending with, what we are dealing with, and what has been the mythology of humanity for a very long time. God bless everyone. I hope you enjoyed the show. Until next week. Well, we've got just a couple of minutes remaining, so but for those that would like to catch up and follow up, I will be on Truth Frequency Radio tomorrow night with Dr. Joy Jeffries Pugh, and so please, if you can, do come and join us for that broadcast. We'll be talking about the conference and some of the topics we're going to cover in discussion, and also what she's been up to and what she's been studying, researching, and bringing forth in contemplation. So have a good night, everyone. Be blessed. Until next week. Shalom.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.